This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired.
Which one?
Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Nerds, brought to you by the Fan Up Network. I am Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter at Jarvie the King, and it's always a good day when I get to talk about fantasy football. It's the last podcast in the month of June, and when the next podcast comes out, it's going to be July. And July just feels a lot closer to football. July means the start of NFL training camps, even in college football. It doesn't have anything to do with fantasy football, but all the football juices just really get going. And we're going to start off this show with some NFL news that I think will pertain to you guys and when you're constructing your fantasy teams. So to start off, Kyle Rudolph of the Minnesota Vikings, we already covered him in a previous podcast, but he still thinks that everyone is underrating him, and that he even admits that the world revolves around fantasy football, and that's just the nature of the sports, and people don't appreciate when he catches two balls. He knows that was his game. Unfortunately for Kyle Rudolph, that doesn't help us fantasy owners. Kyle Rudolph, he had career highs, 49 catches, 495 yards, and I'm sure that he'd like to improve on those numbers, including his touchdowns, but I'm just not sure if he's going to be able to take that next step this year because Teddy Bridgewater is still progressing as a quarterback, so his production will really be tied to as Teddy Bridgewater becomes a better quarterback. Reggie Bush, currently not on any NFL roster. He's trying to recover from tearing his ACL, but he went on the radio earlier this week and said that his body feels great, and even though he had the injury last year, that he's ready to go, and he thinks that he still has a little bit of football left in him. He didn't do a ton last year. Obviously, he got hurt, which Reggie Bush always does get hurt. It's kind of synonymous. Reggie Bush takes the handoff, and then he hurts his knee. I'm not sure if he does get picked up, if he'd really be worth it to take a gamble. If you have the roster space, definitely stash him away. But at this point, until he gets picked up by a team, I'd stay away from him. On the Miami Dolphins, Kenyon Drake, the rookie running back out of Alabama, he's saying that his hamstring is fine. He's going to be ready for camp. And he's a guy that I actually like him a lot better than Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry's in a bad situation in Tennessee. And Kenyon Drake, I think he has a really good shot to be the number 2 behind Jay Ajayi. He could at times even outperform him in games. But definitely keep an eye on Kenyon Drake. He's a guy who I like late in drafts. He's a flyer player to stash on your team. Andrew Luck, we've talked about him before numerous times, and he had a bad season last year, and he admits that even when he didn't play well, even when he was healthy. He said, injuries aside, I was not playing very good football before the injuries even happened, and that he needs to get better. It's great that he can acknowledge that, because some quarterbacks will put it all on the injury, that it wasn't his fault, he was dealing with a bad hand. So seeing that Andrew Luck recognizes that he wasn't up to the standard that we've come to expect from him. He's a former number 1 overall pick. So I think Andrew Luck, as I said, I think he's going to be a good quarterback this season. He may have early struggles, but Andrew Luck seems to be on the right track. Eric Decker, wide receiver from the Jets, that quarterback situation is still not set. And him and Brandon Marshall seem to be doing everything they can to get the Jets to just sign Ryan Fitzpatrick. The dude almost got them to the playoffs, and you're really going to see a drop in production from them if Geno Smith ends up being the starting quarterback. Eric Decker said, I hope something gets worked out one way or the other so we cannot have distractions going into training camp. I think for any team to have success, you have to have some kind of direction. And with training camp, that's where you get the timing. That's where you kind of build the team and build your identity. And I know that he wants to have Ryan Fitzpatrick. They've already had an entire year with him, and they've seen what they can do. And I think if you bring in Geno Smith, they go back to square one, essentially. For the Seahawks, they're saying that they're really liking what they have at running back. Obviously, not having Marshawn Lynch for the first time in a while is going to hurt, but we saw from Thomas Rawls last year that he was a productive running back, but obviously he had the injury. But they're liking what they're seeing out of their other running backs that they've gotten. CJ Prosise and Alex Collins are both turning out pretty good. And Pete Carroll even said that the team had a really big plan for third rounder CJ Prosise, which is kind of what I've been saying. Prosise he's a running back, wide receiver type player. They're going to play him out of the backfield. They're going to probably line him up at wide receiver at times. So definitely watch that situation as it progresses through camp. Thomas Rawls, obviously you want to make sure that he's healthy, ready to go for the beginning of the season. But also watch the other running backs behind him. CJ Prosise, definitely. And the Raiders, which I'll talk a little bit later in my Around the League segment, they're saying that they really like their rookie running back DeAndre Washington out of Texas Tech, and that they think he has the ability to be an every down back, which is really surprising because after Latavius Murray, it really didn't look like there was anybody behind him. I mean, last year you had Roy Halou, Tywan Jones, and I think I even lined up a few snaps back there for Oakland, but their running back situation isn't very good. So definitely watch the Raiders in camp because Latavius Murray does have some injury issues, and if they're going to go to a backup, DeAndre Washington may actually get some solid time as a number 2 running back. And to wrap up the NFL news, DeMarco Murray came out and he's saying that he is completely glad to be running the style that he's always been running. Last year when he was in Philadelphia, it wasn't what he was used to. He was used to on Dallas running behind that gigantic offensive line and plowing straight ahead, where Chip Kelly, he's a mastermind, but it's not the normal style of offense. And DeMarco Murray came out. He's saying that the scheme that they're running in Tennessee, it's strictly downhill, and that's what he's been accustomed to his entire life. Nothing against last year, what happened, it just didn't work out. But he's really excited going into this season. So I like DeMarco Murray. I think he's gonna be one of those running backs who I think he's gonna have a bounce back year. As we talked about in episode before, that their running back situation is they have so many guys there. They have DeMarco Murray, but then they went and spent a high draft pick on Derrick Henry. They still have Antonio Andrews. They also have another draft pick that they spent on David Cobb. There's so many guys there that I think DeMarco Murray is just going to get the bulk of those carries. And more than likely, because they spent such a high draft pick, Derrick Henry will be the second running back by if not the beginning of the season, he'll likely be the number 2 guy by the end of the season. That'll wrap up the news portion of the podcast, and we'll dive right into around the league, where I go around to the different conferences and talk about the players on each team that you should be looking for in your drafts. So we've covered the North, the South, and last week we started in the NFC West. So we'll wrap that region up, and we'll cover the AFC West. And we'll start off with the reigning Super Bowl champions, the Denver Broncos, who I'm not sure if I've seen a Super Bowl champion in such a precarious position in a while, because the big thing on any football team, the main position is your quarterback. And they had Peyton Manning. He led them to, I wouldn't say he really led them to the Super Bowl. It was really Von Miller and that defense that carried them to that Super Bowl win last year. But Peyton Manning, he retired. And the guy that they had really tapped to replace Peyton Manning when he was gone, Brock Osweiler, he took the money and run and went to Houston. So they're really left high and dry at this moment. And they're really still having a quarterback battle. Right now, they're probably their number one starter is Mark Sanchez, but they spent a high draft pick on Paxton Lynch, and then they've also been saying that Trevor Siemian, who was the third quarterback last year, is really still in the running. It's really hard to predict who's gonna really take the reins and be the quarterback on the team. I'd probably say come week 1, Mark Sanchez is going to be your starter. But I really wouldn't be surprised if any one of those guys takes the reins because it's a crapshoot. They need to do whatever they can to make sure that offense can run smoothly. At running back, they have C.J. Anderson and Ronnie Hillman, who both kind of... they let people down last year. C.J. Anderson was tapped as one of the best running backs last year, and he just fell flat on his face. And Ronnie Hillman, neither one of those guys could really solidify that number one spot. And going into camp, I think it's going to be more of the same. If I had to pick anyone before that, if I had to put anyone ahead of the other, I'd say it'd go C.J. Anderson and then Ronnie Hillman. But then I also like the rookie running back that they went out and drafted in Devontae Booker. We've seen before in Denver where they aren't really married to one running back. So I wouldn't be surprised if Booker comes in and maybe steals some carries. And if he shows that he's good enough, I wouldn't be surprised if Booker is a starter by the end of the season. But more than likely, it's going to be a mix of C.J. Anderson and Ronnie Hillman. At wide receiver, they have a lot of talent. Starting off with Demaryius Thomas. Regardless of who the quarterback is, he's going to have a really good season. He's going to be a top 10 wide receiver. But it definitely will help if one of those guys really comes forward and becomes a great quarterback, whether it's Mark Sanchez or whether it's Paxton Lynch. But Demaryius Thomas, he's going to be drafted probably in the top 3 rounds. And you could arguably put him in the top 5 of wide receivers just on skill alone. The quarterback position definitely hurts him. After him, you got Emmanuel Sanders, who's a great number 2 wide receiver who is going to get a lot of targets. They're probably going to have to be throwing on this team because if C.J. Anderson and Ronnie Hillman can't pick it up, Emmanuel Sanders is going to benefit. Sanders and Thomas are both going to get a ton of looks on this team. And then beyond them, you have Benny Fowler, who caught the last pass of Peyton Manning, and Cody Latimer, who they're probably not valuable too much in fantasy. If I had to put one ahead of the other, I'd put Benny Fowler. But more than likely, I would just let these guys go undrafted, and they're going to be waiver wire pickups. At tight end, they had Owen Daniels last year. He's not on the team anymore. It's really it isn't a very good position for them right now, unless Virgil Green or Garrett Graham shows that they have the potential of being a really solid fantasy option. They're likely going to be sitting on the waiver wire. So to wrap up the Denver Broncos, Mark Sanchez, Trevor Siemian, Paxton Lynch, until you really know which one of those guys is going to be the starter, I'm going to hold off. And I'll likely say it's going to be Mark Sanchez. And if you're drafting him in your fantasy leagues, I'd probably wait on him, even though this has the potential of being a powerful offense. I don't trust Mark Sanchez right now. I would look for him as a backup quarterback, so I'd look for him in the middle to late rounds in your drafts. C.J. Anderson, I'd probably look somewhere in the 4th round for him. I know he's likely to go higher, but he burned people last year. So I'm going to put a 4th round value on him. And Ronnie Hillman, I drop him down to the middle rounds because he's a guy who they just essentially keep giving him chances, but he hasn't capitalized. And Devontae Booker, I think he's a late round flyer. I definitely think you should draft him. I have the same kind of feeling about him that I have about CJ Prosise. I think both of those guys are going to be valuable for their teams this year. Demaryius Thomas, I think he's worthy. You could draft him as early as the 2nd round, so 2nd, 3rd round for Demaryius Thomas. Emmanuel Sanders, I'd put him maybe in the later part of the 4th rounds, but I'd feel a little bit more comfortable in the 5th or 6th rounds for Sanders. And Benny Fowler, Cody Latimer, and even Virgil Green, Garrett Graham, I let all those guys really slide either until the late round, like the last round really, or just let them go undrafted. So the next team in the AFC West, we have the Kansas City Chiefs, finished 11-5, and I think they have the potential to really take a hold of the AFC West this season. You saw what they did last season. Alex Smith isn't a great fantasy quarterback, but he gets the job done. I think you think about him and you don't really think that he's a great starter, which he isn't. But I think he has the potential to be a solid backup quarterback in fantasy football. And he's going to have weeks here and there where he has really good numbers because he does have some pretty solid options all around him. And that top option that you give Alex Smith is Jamal Charles. Obviously, he's coming back from an injury, but Jamal Charles is still going to be a top running back. And if he can stay healthy a full year, he has the potential to be the best running back in the league. Luckily, you do have some decent backups behind him. You have Sharkhandrick West and Spencer Ware. And if you draft Jamal Charles this year, I'd really stress drafting one of these guys. Sharkhandrick West may go earlier than he's really valued. So I would try to get one of those guys. If you miss out on West, wait a little bit, and maybe you can even wait a little bit longer and try and pick up Spencer Ware, because Charles is, if you miss Charles for any period of time in your season, it's likely a death sentence for your fantasy season. At running back or at wide receiver, Jeremy Maclin, I think people weren't sure what he was going to do in his first season, going from the Eagles. He had a great season with the Eagles, and we didn't know what he was going to do because we all saw what Alex Smith did to wide receivers, that he hadn't had a touchdown pass to a wide receiver the season before. And Jeremy Maclin really came in, and I think he gave him a stabilizing presence there at wideout. So Jeremy Maclin, I think he has the potential. He's likely a top 15 wide receiver. He's not a guy that I want to be my number one wide receiver, but I think he's a very, very good second wide receiver on your fantasy teams. But beyond Jeremy Maclin, the wide receiver position is scarce at best. You have Albert Wilson, Rod Streeter, and Chris Conley. All those guys do nothing for me. More than likely, Albert Wilson may be a late round pick, but all those guys, I would just let them go undrafted. And if Maclin does get hurt, you're probably going to be better off getting a different wide receiver, because Alex Smith isn't going to be able to find one of those other guys. And really, the second option after Jamal Charles, after Jeremy Maclin, for Alex Smith, is their tight end, and that's Travis Kelce. He had a really solid season last year. He definitely has his injury issues, but when he's healthy, Travis Kelce is a top 10 tight end, and he has that ability. So to wrap up the Kansas City Chiefs, you have Alex Smith. I would let him wait until the later rounds of the draft. And people who draft Alex Smith, I would look for those people to have drafted, an Aaron Rodgers and Andrew Luck, one of those top quarterbacks. You can wait and stash depth and then pick up Alex Smith as your backup. and maybe you don't win that bye week, but Alex Smith is going to be at least dependable for you. And at running back, Jamal Charles, he's going to go in the first round. He may fall to the later part of the first round because of his injury last year, and people may be a little wary drafting him, but he's definitely a first-round pick. Charkandrick West, I'd look for him probably in the middle part of the draft. Somebody may jump up a little bit earlier and try and, sneak in and steal a handcuff from you, but I wouldn't be too worried about it. And Spencer Ware, more of a later round guy. And really the only reason you should be drafting Spencer Ware is if you have Jamal Charles. Wide receiver, Jeremy Maclin, I'd probably feel good drafting him in the later part of the 4th round, going into the 5th round. As I said, I think he's a really good second option, a number 2 wide receiver on your team. But somebody may jump up if they are looking for wide receiver help. So somewhere in the 4th round, I'd look for Jeremy Maclin. And as I said, for all those other wide receivers, Albert Wilson, maybe late in the draft. But I would let all of those guys slide in your drafts. Let them go to the waiver wire. And at tight end, Travis Kelce, I'd maybe look for him in the late 6th or 7th round. He has the ability to change games for you, but he does have those the injury problems. So probably somewhere in the 7th round. And really, if you do feel comfortable about your team, I might even let it slide and let them slide down to the 8th or 9th round, because that's really where I'd feel more comfortable drafting a guy like Travis Kelce. So I'm going to take a quick break. When I come back, we'll wrap up the rest of the AFC West, and we'll have the King's Decree. You're listening to The Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. The Fantasy Nerd Show is sponsored by the Fan Up Network. They've developed the ultimate fantasy football app. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need. You can track teams and scores across multiple platforms, get latest injury and player news, and access to expert advice. See the hot trends with waiver pickups and drops. It has everything you need to manage all your fantasy football teams. Android users can get the app in the Play Store, and an iPhone version is now available in the App Store. Go to fanupnetwork.com to learn more and follow them on Twitter at fanupnetwork. Welcome back to the Fantasy Nerds. We'll now wrap up the rest of the AFC West. Now, the Broncos obviously have some question marks, and the Kansas City Chiefs, it's really, it's a 4 main guys. The rest of them aren't that good. And these next 2 teams do have some really interesting players on their team. So the 3rd place team in the AFC West last year, the Oakland Raiders. Now, they finished 7-9, but I think they have a lot of promising pieces on their team. And it all starts with their quarterback, Derek Carr. He really started to develop last year into a really good fantasy quarterback, a really good NFL quarterback just in general. And I think Derek Carr has the ability. I think he could make the leap this year and be a really good fantasy quarterback. We've seen quarterbacks before have good fantasy seasons, but not have a good NFL season. Case in point, look at Matt Stafford of the Lions. I'm a homer. I can admit that. The guy has really good fantasy seasons, but it just doesn't mean you're going to have success. So I think Derek Carr has that ability. Whether the Raiders as a whole can get into the playoffs, that doesn't really matter for us because we're talking about fantasy football. So I think Derek Carr going to be a good fantasy quarterback this year. I would probably put him right outside the top 10 quarterbacks. After him, you have Latavius Murray for running back, and the guy has a lot of potential. He does have injury problems, as I said before in the NFL news, that there really isn't a whole lot beyond Latavius Murray. So he's a guy who really is a bell cow running back. He's gonna get you a lot of touches, and he does it all for them. He catches out of the backfield. you're not looking at a ton behind Latavius Murray. You have Roy Halou, Taiwan Jones, and Jameez Olawale, who, if Latavius Murray goes down, I would much rather see what the rookie running back who we talked about, DeAndre Washington. I really think he's going to, throughout camp, become that number 2 option. But more than likely, Latavius Murray is the guy that you're looking for on your fantasy team. At wide receiver, you got Amari Cooper, who's really leading the crew, who he may have had he didn't have a super spectacular rookie season. I think people were expecting him to come in and just, you saw what Odell Beckham did, and I think people just assumed that Amari Cooper could do the same thing. But as we know, Odell Beckham Jr. is, he's his own player. Amari Cooper definitely came in and showed his talents, and I think with the development of Derek Carr, Amari Cooper is going to be a really good wide receiver in this league. And he has help behind him in Michael Crabtree. And it's a really good 1-2 punch with Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree. Crabtree really kind of reinvented himself last year with Oakland. And I think it's a really good fit because, Cooper and Crabtree both kind of, they're route runners, and they're just by the books wide receivers. And beyond them, there isn't a ton. If I had to pick anybody, I'd probably look at Seth Roberts. He's going to have a game here or there. You'll likely see, Derek Carr doesn't throw a touchdown to Amari Cooper or Michael Crabtree, and you'll go, who's this Seth Roberts guy? But keep him on your radar, but I'm not sure if he's good enough to get drafted. If anything, I'd probably put him at a late round pick. And tight end is a little sparse on the team. You have Clive Walford, who he's probably in the top 20 of tight ends, but he's somebody who most people don't even really carry more than one tight end on their team. So I wouldn't blame you if you just left Clive Walford out there. Leave him on the waiver wire for when you need to pick somebody up on your bye week. So to wrap up the Oakland Raiders, Derek Carr, I would probably draft him somewhere in the middle rounds. He's going to be that really, really good backup on your team. I don't necessarily want him to be my starter at the moment, but he could be that guy, kind of like Carson Palmer last year, where you draft him looking to be your backup, but Derek Carr actually outperforms whoever you draft ahead of him. Latavius Murray, because he's a starting running back, he's likely going to go in the first 4 rounds, and I'd probably say the end of the second and the beginning of the third is where I'd feel comfortable taking Latavius Murray. Halou, Taiwan Jones, Olawale, I'd maybe look at them later in the draft. I wouldn't blame you if you just let them go and let them just sit on the waiver wire. And DeAndre Washington, I'd actually look before any of those guys. And I would draft him probably in the later rounds of the draft, really just for depth. Amari Cooper, I think he has the ability. I'd look for him probably in the 4th round. And Michael Crabtree, I'd look for him starting in the later parts of the 6th into the 7th. He may even slide a little bit, maybe into the later parts of the 8th or 9th rounds, depending on how training camps go. And Seth Roberts, as I said, maybe a late round depth stash, but he's more than likely going to go undrafted. And Clive Walford, again, a guy who I think should probably go undrafted. And the worst team in the AFC West, at 4-12, the San Diego Chargers, who I think it's 4-12. It just seems kind of weird looking at the talent that they have on their team. But obviously they did have a lot of injuries that they were working through. And they do play in a really solid division. They had to go up against the Super Bowl champs and the 11-5 Kansas City Chiefs. So with the San Diego Chargers, Phillip Rivers kind of reinvented himself last year. He went from being a fantasy dud. people were really worried about having them as their starting quarterback to really being a dependable quarterback for parts of the season. He definitely still has his games where he may kind of spaz out, but Phillip Rivers is a decent fantasy quarterback. And I again, kind of like Derek Carr, I'd put him on right around the top 10 of quarterbacks, maybe just outside. I think there's other quarterbacks that I'd want to have before him, but certainly if you do have to start Phillip Rivers, he's going to have a lot of talent around him this year. Melvin Gordon at running back, definitely a disappointment. People were saying that he was going to be the best rookie running back from last season. Obviously, they were wrong. Todd Gurley was head and shoulders the best rookie running back last year. But from everything they're saying out of the Chargers camp right now is that Melvin Gordon is looking really good. He was dealing with injuries last year. And I think it's a little too early to get really excited about Melvin Gordon. But I think there is, a little bit of hope there. I'm going to wait on him for a little part of that draft. I think there's other running backs and there's other wide receivers that I'd rather draft before Melvin Gordon. And certainly another running back on the team who has a lot of value more in PPR leagues is Danny Woodhead, who he was right up there in the top receptions for the Chargers last year until he got hurt. He has a lot of value in PPR. It definitely drops once you go into standard leagues, but it's a name that you got to know. If you are just starting a PPR league, Danny Woodhead, definitely, I would keep him on your radar, and he shoots up in drafts in those leagues. And then to back those guys up, they do have Brandon Oliver, who suffered season-ending injury last year. He's likely not going to be drafted. If anything, I'd put him later in the draft. But Brandon Oliver is somebody who's going to sit on the waiver wire. And Gordon and Danny Woodhead are likely going to get hurt at some point this season, whether it's, for part of a game or if they're out for a longer period of time. And that's when you're going to want to look for Brandon Oliver. At wide receiver, you have a really, really good wide receiver in Keenan Allen. He had a solid start to the season last year, and I think he could have competed for the top spot last year, but obviously had the season-ending injury. And you're going to want to watch him going into training camp this year to make sure that he's all healthy, because if he is healthy enough, he has the ability to be your number one wide receiver. But obviously that all goes making sure that he is fully healthy 100%, because if he is slowed a little bit, his value drops. Now, they went out and they signed free agent wide receiver Travis Benjamin, who is a really good compliment to Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen is a guy who goes over the middle. He's a possession wide receiver. I compare him a lot to a Larry Fitzgerald. He's just a solid wide receiver, runs his routes. Where Travis Benjamin he's the guy who's going to run a fly route, and Phillip Rivers can bomb him the ball. And if both of those guys are healthy, they're going to have field days. Travis Benjamin could have he had a pretty breakout season last year in Cleveland. I think the potential for him to have an even better season it magnifies here with a better quarterback, with a better team. So I would look Travis Benjamin. At times he was a wide receiver one last year. At times he wasn't even worth playing. But I'd probably look for him as somewhere in the middle for a wide receiver twos in fantasy football. And then beyond them, they do have two pretty dependable backups in Stevie Johnson and Dontrell Inman. It's all going to depend on how Allen and Benjamin, how they stay healthy. Because if the two guys in front of them are healthy the entire year, Stevie Johnson and Dontrell Inman, they'll have a game here or there where they have pretty decent stats, but it's really going to affect them the entire season. Those are two guys that you're going to want to look late in drafts or just to let them slide into the waiver, because they're value depends on the guys in front of them getting hurt. At tight end, Antonio Gates, another guy who kind of came out of nowhere last year. Everybody kind of thought he was on his last legs. Ladarius Green had a really solid stints while Antonio Gates was hurt. But Ladarius Green also got hurt, and Ladarius Green isn't even there anymore. But definitely helped with Antonio Gates kind of having a second wind in his career. But we're not sure exactly how long that's going to last. Obviously, if he does stay healthy, he has the potential to be a top 10 tight end. But you saw in the draft that they went out, they took Hunter Henry, who is a pretty solid tight end, solid rookie tight end, and I think he's going to be their future. And I'd really look for, if Antonio Gates does miss any time this year, Hunter Henry could be a really solid option in fantasy. Definitely any tight end coming out of San Diego, because Phillip Rivers loves throwing to the tight end. So to wrap up the San Diego Chargers, Phillip Rivers, I'd look for him somewhere in probably the 7th to 8th round, maybe a little bit later. He's going to be, I'd probably draft him as like the 10th to 15th quarterback off the board. Running back Melvin Gordon, I'd feel comfortable drafting him personally. I'd say the beginning of the 5th round. Somebody is likely going to jump up earlier and draft him, but for my own sake, and I hope for your own sake, Melvin Gordon, I'd wait for later parts of the 4th round into the 5th round for him. And Danny Woodhead, in PPR leagues, I'd put him right up there in 4th or 5th round. But in standard leagues, I think Danny Woodhead drops to somewhere in the middle parts of the draft, just because he's going to be relying on catches out of the backfield and receiving touchdowns. And then Brandon Oliver, likely go undrafted. If anything, I think he is a late round grab. At wide receiver, Keenan Allen, I think as long as he's healthy, I think it's safe to draft him in the 3rd round. I wouldn't be surprised going as high as the 3rd round. Maybe more of a 4th round guy, but I think that people aren't going to sleep on him this year. Travis Benjamin, I'd look probably 6th, 7th round for him. And Stevie Johnson and Dontrell Inman, I'd look for more in the later rounds of drafts, or just to let him slide. Antonio Gates, I'd look for somewhere in the middle part of the draft. And if you have room, or maybe if you're looking for a keeper, and I do feel a little dirty saying a keeper on a tight end, but Hunter Henry could be an interesting stash late in your draft. So that wraps up the Around the NFL segment, and we'll wrap up this episode of Fantasy Nerds with the King's Decree. With the King's Decree, every week I give you a bold prediction, and we'll check back later in the season to see just how right I was or just how wrong I was. I've been going up and down in my predictions, and with this prediction, I feel like a lot of people are going to look at me like I'm crazy, and I might just be crazy, and part of it is because it's a player that's close to my heart, and it's close to the team that I love, and my decree this week is that the Lions' Golden Tate will be a top 10 wide receiver this year. That's right, you heard me. It's not Calvin Johnson. He's not there anymore. Golden Tate will be a top 10 wide receiver this year. As I said, with no Calvin Johnson, no Megatron, Golden Tate is going to be the leader of that wide receiver group. They have Marvin Jones. They have TJ Jones. They have Jeremy Curley. They have whoever else they want to add on there. But Golden Tate is going to be the clear leader of that group. And we saw in the season where Calvin missed some time, Golden Tate, he had 1,300 plus yards. He had 140 targets. He really kind of took over when Calvin was hurting the season before last. And I think the Lions are very close. And I could, again, A lot of people are going to call me crazy, and part of it is because I love the Lions. But, having a very close eye on this team, I have a good read of what's going to happen. With their schedule, I think they could have a really good season, and I'm going to predict that Golden Tate gets somewhere in the midst of 1,300 plus yards. He's going to have 100 plus receptions, and the big kicker, I think he's going to have at least 10 touchdowns. Now, he hasn't had over 7 touchdowns. 1,300 yards, I think, is perfectly manageable. He had that 2 years ago. 100 receptions, I think that's perfectly easy to get. The touchdowns is going to be the big thing. And I think with no Calvin Johnson there, he's going to be one of the main benefactors of that team. So Golden Tate, a top 10 wide receiver this year, and that is the King's decree. And that will do it for this episode of the Fantasy Nerds. I love spending time with you guys. We only have a couple more divisions to go through. We'll go to the East next week. I'll start with the NFC East. I'll have another King's Decree. And it's almost time for mini camps to start happening. And then we'll really get into the meat of draft. And there'll be more news. And I'm super excited. I'm hoping you guys are super excited for fantasy season to get started. But I am Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter at Jarvie the King. Until next time, see you later, nerds.